Folks online, welcome to our panel. We are so delighted to be a part of your journey into the online brave new world of PAX. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us from our illustrious home studios. Let me introduce us to you. My name is Aaron Suduiko. I am the founder and chief video game analyst of With a Terrible Fate. I'm here with my amazing, very best mates and colleagues, Dan Hughes and Max Gorynski, fellow video game analysts. If you haven't heard of With a Terrible Fate before, we are a relatively small but very passionate online publication dedicated just to analyzing the storytelling of video games. That is the one thing we do, mostly in long form written articles on our site, which you can find at withaterriblefate.com. I know you're all by your computers, so bookmark it for later or whatever you want to do. But the other kind of content that we're very passionate about producing is presentations to share with the wonderful people of PAX. We've been fortunate enough to do that all over the world. And it's really one of our favorite things to do because we always find some of just the most passionate and sharp gamers to talk about these amazing stories with and think about what makes them tick. We're sorry not to be able to be with you in person. We are going to ask, to the degree that you're able, hold off on commenting and chatting while we're talking. The way that we give our presentations is by talking you through a topic and sharing our thoughts for the entire hour. But afterwards, we would love to talk with you. That's our favorite part of doing this. So we're going to ask you, if you'd like to do that, to head over to PAX Online's official discussion channel in their Discord. We will all be hanging out there. More than happy to take all your questions, talk with you about this for as long as you want to hang out with us. What is our topic for today? Well, we're actually doing something a little unusual, not unlike PAX is doing, right? We're combining our typical topic, which is the storytelling of video games, with the storytelling of another medium, which is very near and dear to our hearts, namely Magic the Gathering. And we're going to do something similar to what Magic the Gathering, the card game, actually did with one of their sets last year, War of the Spark, which I have illustrated for you on the screen here. If you don't know Yoshitaka Amano by name, you probably know him by art. He's basically the father of the visual artistry of the Final Fantasy series, as you see on the right side of the screen, with him representing some of the iconic characters of Final Fantasy X. And on the left side of the screen, you see the art that Chris Rallis did, representing one of the famous characters in the Magic the Gathering universe, namely the Necromancer, Liliana Vess. And what Magic did for this set last year was they actually reached out to some famous Japanese artists in order to engage with their Japanese Magic the Gathering community. And one of the collaborations they did was actually Yoshitaka Amano representing that very same version of Liliana Vess on a card in his own artistic style. And so hopefully you can see, just taking a look at this picture, how by melding together the visions of this famous Japanese artist and the creative minds of Magic the Gathering, we're able to get something new and gain new insights into both. That's basically all we're doing in this panel. We're going to be asking ourselves the question, when we put these two storytelling media that we love so much into conversation with one another, that is Magic the Gathering and JRPGs, what can they learn from each other, and what can we as players, frankly, learn about ourselves? I want to walk you through a little bit about just what these are as groundwork before we dive into things. Hopefully, since you're here and you read the name of the panel, you know about at least one of these two things. But just as groundwork, JRPG just stands for Japanese role-playing game. For our purposes, that literally just means a single-player, story-focused video game developed in Japan. If you don't know Magic the Gathering, encourage you to check it out. It's really kind of the godfather of modern trading card games. It's been around for decades at this point, and the great thing about its interactive storytelling is that every time that Wizards of the Coast releases a new set of cards, they also expand the story that works in the background and grounds what these cards are all about. So they have iconic characters like Liliana, whom you saw, like some of the ones represented on these packs. They go on adventures throughout the multiverse across these different planes, and their adventures and the characters themselves and all of these events are cataloged and represented in the collectible trading cards that you can pull from packs like you see on the screen, and which you can use to assemble decks to play a meticulously crafted and engineered trading card game, which is competitive, which is something you can do with your friends, which is something I'm sure you can see at other venues and packs. But we're going to be thinking about it mostly in this panel, again, from a storytelling perspective. Let me tell you a little bit about how we got here. Again, what we do on the site is focused just on the storytelling of video games. So how this panel came about is kind of an interesting story. So what we usually do, right, is we think about what makes the stories of video games so special and interesting. And that means basically looking at them on two levels. So when you see a JRPG like Xenoblade Chronicles, which I have represented here, if you've played it, hopefully you'll agree with me that it has an amazing story. And that's great to talk about just on the levels of the characters in that story, the things that happen, the themes that it discusses. That's one level, right? But then, because we also love and are crazy about video games as an interactive medium that we believe is able to tell stories that other media, such as the novel or a film, cannot, we also take a step back and ask ourselves, all right, if we look at the medium through which the story is being represented and the interactive components that allow the player to actually become a part of the story, are there any interesting aspects of that that make the story interesting, not merely as a narrative, but as a narrative conveyed as a video game? And in the case of many of the games that we talk about on the site, the reason why we talk about them is that the answer to that is yes. And in the case of Xenoblade Chronicles, for instance, it's precisely the interactive nature of the game that allows it to tell a uniquely coherent version of the story of characters being trapped in an inescapable fate and yet ultimately overcoming it. Something that a lot of stories attempt to do in media, but which I've argued on the site in an article that I encourage you to check out if you're interested, is uniquely coherent and comprehensible when it's represented through the kind of interactive form that Xenoblade presents. But as the analysts of the site, have started going further down the track, thinking about what makes video games so special. We've been fortunate enough to be doing this for 5 years. We've also found ourselves asking the question, all right, given that we love other interactive media too, like Magic, can we ask the same questions of it? So with something like Magic the Gathering, we can look at that background story and say, all right, these characters are amazing. I love Jace. Nissa's the best. Things like that. Here are the adventures they're going on. Let's talk about that. But then let's also take a step back and ask, given the unique kind of interactiveness that happens in the case of Magic the Gathering, where players collect these cards and are able to organize them into decks and tell stories through the competitions that they have with other players, are there any interesting, unique storytelling dynamics that come specifically out of that? And then, more to the point for this presentation that we're giving you, when we put these two forms of narrative in conversation with one another, can we learn more about the total universe of possibilities when it comes to interactive storytelling? And since it is, by virtue of being interactive, involving the players, can we learn more about ourselves as these kind of special agents who are able to exert our will on these interactive stories and their worlds in increasingly complicated and wonderful ways as the overall mode of interactive storytelling just continues to evolve over the years? Let me give you a roadmap of where we're going as we explore this question with you in this panel. So first, I'm going to start with a very specific issue to bring us into thinking about this on a microscopic level. I'm going to talk about a specific issue that I've had with JRPGs in the past and how thinking about them in relation to Magic actually allowed me to solve that issue and get excited about the future of JRPGs and video game storytelling. Then we're going to zoom out a little bit, and Dan is going to talk about how the conversations that players of Magic have and that players of video games have when they interact with each other through those stories is actually creating a new language almost that riffs on one of the most basic purposes of storytelling that's ever existed, which is to communicate with one another. Finally, we're going to zoom out even further with Max, who's going to consider, based on the total universe of possible ways to interact with these stories that are interactive by nature, how can we come to better understand ourselves as players and indeed think about not only our own identity, but also the specific personas that we adopt in these different kinds of stories and what that says about us. That's where we're going. Like I said, we're going to start with something very specific, which is an issue that I've had with how JRPGs are adopting make your own avatars. If you're not familiar with these by the name that I've given them, I'm basically just talking about any game that comes up front with a character creation system where you basically design the avatar from a bunch of preset options that the game is giving you. And one consequence of this is that not only is the avatar tailored to your particular specifications, what you want them to look like and sound like as a player, but they're also typically a silent protagonist, with the thought being if the avatar were spouting a lot of dialogue that the player didn't have any control over, that would kind of undermine the point in the first place of giving the player the ability to determine and tailor the avatar as a representation of themselves or simply as the way that they wanted to play the game. very common now, and increasingly so in traditionally story-driven genres of video games, such as the JRPG. And in principle, that's an interesting idea. But the issue is that as I looked at how these make your own avatars were being implemented in JRPGs, I found myself in this puzzle of trying to understand why it seemed so uneven, the way in which they were implemented, which is to say, sometimes I would see a game with a make your own avatar, and it would tell a great story and be really compelling and interesting. And in other cases, it would seem like the game story just fell flat by virtue of having a make your own avatar in it. And I had no way of being able to figure out what it was that would make a game be successful or be a failure by virtue of having a make your own avatar in it. And so I want to walk you through how I came to that puzzle in the first place, and then how by thinking about it in the context of Magic the Gathering, I actually was able to find a possible solution to that puzzle that also opened up a really new and interesting avenue for JRPG storytelling in general. And to walk you through that, I'm going to give you two examples of games with make your own avatars, one of which I think is unsuccessful in its storytelling, which is Xenoblade Chronicles Cross. Much love I give to the series, but I think that this one in particular is a failure in terms of its storytelling. And then the other being Dark Souls, which I think is a resounding success in many ways, but one of them being the way in which it deploys a make your own avatar. You might disagree with my particular assessments of these games. That's fine. That's not the point I'm trying to make. My hope is that even if you do, you can find in your own gaming history examples of games with make your own avatars, some of which you felt were really successful and some of which were not. But in the case of these two games, the really interesting thing to me, right, is that they both have a very similar avatar creation system, right? You create this speechless avatar that's designed to your specifications, and then you proceed through a story in which lots of stuff happens. NPCs talk to each other and they talk to you, but you don't really talk back, and your avatar does a bunch of things along the way. And yet, the way that these stories feel as the player is very different based on these two games. In the case of Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, I at least got this strange feeling of alienation from what was happening in the plot, where it seemed as though all of these characters whom my avatar would meet were interacting basically around the avatar and talking to each other, or sometimes talking at the avatar. And so even though the avatar was the central character in the story and all of the events that were happening revolved around the avatar seemed like this kind of nondescript blob that I had designed at the beginning of the game, but didn't have any distinctive characteristics unto itself, and therefore was not really interesting or able to rightly interact with the story. On the other hand, with Dark Souls, you have that same kind of interaction between the make your own avatar and the characters in this world and the bosses, and everything that happens in the game is directly related to the avatar. Yet the story, in my view, as much as you can understand the story going through it, feels coherent. You don't feel alienated from it in the same way that it feels like the story is just happening in your vicinity in Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, up to the point where you meet Gwyn, the final boss at the end of the game. And even if you haven't been able to track the story so far all the way to understand everything that's happening, the ending feels consonant, and you understand that there's something narratively meaningful in which you are taking part there. So the question and this puzzle, right, is what explains the difference? Why is it that make your own avatars can be very successful in some JRPGs and very unsuccessful in others, even though, for all intents and purposes, the way that they are deploying make your own avatars, for all I've said, is identical. And that's the exact puzzle that Magic the Gathering, as I looked at how it tells its story, was able to solve and unpack for me. To show you how it does that, I want to start just with an observation that I think anyone who's played Magic the Gathering would agree with, which is how the act of playing the game of Magic the Gathering interacts, or more to the point, does not interact with the background story that Wizards of the Coast releases with every set, right? So in the case of every set of Magic the Gathering, there's an elaborate, really interesting background story that is represented through those particular cards. What I'm showing you right now is a screenshot from the cinematic trailer that represents that background story for a set that they released last year, War of the Spark, which is basically Magic the Gathering's version of Infinity War. And one of the key events that happens there is Liliana, the necromancer I talked about earlier, whom you see in the foreground, turning against and revolting against Nicol Bolas, that dragon who's trying to become the god of the entire multiverse. And she decides to take a dramatic stand against him in order to try to save the multiverse. Now, because Magic is a card game, something that you have the really cool opportunity to do is collect cards that actually represent that very version of Liliana, whom we started this whole presentation with, and that version of Nicol Bolas. And you, as the player who are assuming this role of an avatar, a planeswalker, whenever you sit down and build a deck and play a game of Magic with your friend, another planeswalker, right? You can actually put those two characters, by virtue of their card representations, in the same deck. You have the opportunity to get them out onto the field together, and you can actually have them essentially team up to defeat your opponent and to conquer all of your enemies. Something that is very dissonant with what happened in the background story that I mentioned of Liliana turning against Nicol Bolas. But here's the observation, right? Even if you do that, it never occurs to any Magic player that having Liliana and Nicol Bolas team up in their game is somehow challenging or threatening to alter the events of history of War of the Spark, where Liliana actually turned against Nicol Bolas. It's almost as if the two exist on different planes of storytelling. No pun intended with all the planes that exist in Magic the Gathering. So as I thought about this and discussed this kind of planar segmentation of storytelling that happens in Magic with Dan and with Max, we came to this idea of what might explain that difference. And the thought that we had, which ended up being a really interesting way to unpack that problem with JRPGs, is, well, maybe it's the case that what's happening with that background story in Magic is like history. And players who are assuming the roles of these planeswalkers see it as something that happened in the distant past of the Magic universe, which, by the way, is very consonant with the typical word that Magic players use to describe that background story, namely lore. It's this kind of faded into the past history of events that we know happened, but is not something that's currently happening right now. So that when we sit down and play a game of Magic, it's not as if we're imagining ourselves being inserted into the events of War of the Spark, for example, and having the opportunity to affect or change history. Rather, what's happening is that we have all of these cards, and we as players have this distinctive magical ability to use those cards to invoke different characters and events from that lore, from that deep history of Magic, and tell new stories with them.
So when you sit down and play an individual game of Magic, it's not that you're traveling into the past to try to change things. Rather, you have a distinctive ability to channel those historical characters and create something new with it. You're acting, in this regard, as a kind of magical historian, someone who has created and designed this character from scratch, namely the avatar that you're playing the game of Magic as, with this deck that you've put so much time and care into, if you're like me or most Magic players I know, and you have this distinctive ability to tap into the past and channel it to create this new story. And so what I started thinking about as we unpacked what it is to play a game of Magic in this way was, well, what if we think about that key element of designing your own avatar in the way that you do with Magic, where the avatar is just yourself playing the game of Magic in the deck that you've made, and we expand that analysis to video games where you design your own avatar? Can that help to unpack the puzzle of why that mode of storytelling in JRPGs is sometimes very successful and other times not so successful? And I think the answer is yes. I think that idea of what I'm calling magical historicism, or the idea of acting as a magical historian, actually describes very well the JRPGs in which make your own avatars can be a really successful mode of storytelling. And the key to realizing this is just how different it is from the typical mode of storytelling in a JRPG. So first, let's think about the traditional, right? In the case of a normal video game, sure, the story with which you're engaging is interactive, but it's all been scripted and determined by the creators beforehand, right? You might have options in terms of in which order to visit the cities in a JRPG, or sometimes even which endings you get from the narrative, but the entirety of the characters, your avatars, the relationships, and the potential outcomes to all of that have been carefully, meticulously predetermined by the authors of that game. So even though you have an important and critical role, which is what we study on With a Terrible Fate, in that story as the player, the entire story, including your role in it, has been spelled out for you before you ever sit down and play the game by the creators. You are, in effect, having a story told to you, even though you're participating in the telling of it. Magical historicism, which again is what I'm describing that happens in Magic and what I think works well in Make Your Own Avatars cases, is very different because it basically puts the player, rather than in the seat of the person having the story told to them, in the role of the storyteller. So now it's not that you are just playing along with the story that's been pre-designed and engaging with the plot that's been carefully architected as it's being told to you. Rather, what's happening in the case of something like Magic, and as we'll see in the case of successful JRPGs that go this route, is there is a non-interactive history of the world, what we've been calling the lore, that has been designed and conveyed to the player and exists in the history of that fiction prior to the player's avatar ever showing up. And so that's fixed, right? Then the player comes in and has the opportunity to play in that sandbox. And that playing starts from the act of avatar creation. You have the opportunity to create your own representative and proxy for playing in the world of this fiction. And then what happens from there is up to you, but it's not a matter of receiving the plot of the game that's happening as you interact with it. Rather, it's the experience of uncovering this history that has come before the lore and being able to engage with it in a unique way as the magical historian is able to, whether that's putting together a deck like Magic or meeting characters from this history, as in the case of some of these games, and piecing together that history, playing around with it in a unique way, but in a way that focuses on your exploration rather than a plot unfolding around you. That, I think, is one very interesting way of unpacking what's going on in Dark Souls, right? Because to my point about engaging with a non-interactive history, if you haven't played Dark Souls in a while, you might have forgotten about this. I've played Dark Souls uncountably many times, and there was a period in there where I just played one playthrough after the other and so forgot about this. But there is actually a non-interactive cutscene at the beginning of the game when you start a new game in Dark Souls that explains to you the history of the world before you ever create an avatar, exactly as I'm talking about, right? And in that regard, what you subsequently do as someone who creates an avatar and explores this world is much more about uncovering that lore and meeting characters from that history, whether or not you understand all of it, and just diving into that history and making different creative magical historian choices, like fighting some of the characters from that history and killing them, rather than creating a new history of the world or enacting a plot based on your actions. And in fact, Dark Souls reinforces this point because any actions that you do take as a player, even though you have the opportunity to usher in an age of light or darkness at the end of the game, the point that is very clearly made by the game is that your actions are just going to feed into the cycle of this world. So the focus is not on you doing anything new, which would have had to be carefully architected by the writers of the game beforehand. Rather, it's about your engagement with the history of this world as someone going on this kind of historical adventure, right? I think the problem, which has been illuminated to me by thinking about JRPGs in comparison with Magic, is that, as we saw, the traditional mode of JRPG storytelling is just fundamentally different from what's going on in magical historicism. Because in one case, you're having a story told to you, and in another case, you have the sandbox of historical elements that you get to play around with and tell a story from. And I think in the cases of unsuccessful make your own avatar games such as Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, what's happening is that they're trying to mesh those two things, which are mutually incompatible, together in a way that just doesn't work. And if you think about what a story is, it's pretty clear why that doesn't work, right? If you're telling a story, one thing that's just almost too obvious to mention is that you better be clear and pretty precise and specific about the elements of that story, right? Characters need things like clear motivations and relationships to other characters, especially the characters that are centrally involved in advancing the plot. because otherwise the nuance and interesting things that we love in stories, like complex themes or meaning, or simply just something that elicits a reaction at the end, that can't happen if you're not specific about the elements of the story that are bringing about those themes, right? And when you sit down to architect a story beforehand, if you're one of these video game designers who is telling a story to the player, if one of the central elements of your story is a make your own avatar, then by definition, you are not going to be able to be specific in the way that you could with an avatar that has a specified character with motivations, because make your own avatars have to be capacious in the way that they're designed. They have to have all of these different options that a player can choose from, and they oftentimes can't even speak, let alone have well-defined relationships with other characters, because you have to afford all of that leniency of the player coming in and being able to determine what they want that make your own avatar to look like, such that in practice, when you try to mesh those two different forms of storytelling together in this way, at least if you're in the camp of something like Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, what happens is you get bizarre cutscenes like the one I pulled a screenshot of for you here, where the make your own avatar, who is the main character in the game and has to be centrally involved in events, picks a side when two party members disagree about how to proceed with something, except the player doesn't have any agency over which side the avatar is picking, because it's this pre-scripted story that has to go one way and not the other, right? And the avatar isn't able to really express any clear motivation as to why they've chosen one side over the other, because that kind of motivation couldn't be scripted beforehand by the creators. And so you're left with this kind of non sequitur in the plot, with the make your own avatar making this decision which has clear and stark ramifications for what happens next in the plot, and yet no real explanation for how we got there. And that's because we can now understand and explain we're mixing these two mutually incompatible modes of storytelling, the traditional JRPG with magical historicism. I think the lesson here, which has gotten me really excited, frankly, to think about magic further in conversation with JRPGs, is that there are these two very different kinds of storytelling that, even within the umbrella of interactive video games that are focused on story, video games can achieve, right? One is the typical kind of storytelling that we're used to, but make your own avatars, when properly deployed, can be part of this totally different and really interesting mode, where the story is less about creating the world's history and more about discovering and exploring it, as Dark Souls has rightly become so well known for, right? And as we understand the differences between those, not only can game designers maybe think about new ways to engineer even further branches of storytelling off of those, but we as players have the special opportunity to think of ourselves not just as the interactive agents who uncover JRPG stories in the way that we know and love, but also as these magical historians who can do this really cool work of understanding and uncovering and playing with the lore of a world, much as the Planeswalker player of Magic the Gathering is able to do with its lore, and enact unique interpretations of that history in a way that only a player could do. So with that, I hope you get a chance to explore magic and JRPGs that practice magical historicism in that way. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to move us to the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Aaron. So I am going to continue this conversation about Magic the Gathering and JRPGs by making the logical next step and talking about Star Trek: The Next Generation. So Star Trek: The Next Generation has a particular episode that I think works really well to talk about, to explore what we are talking about here in terms of capabilities of both Magic the Gathering and JRPGs. So this episode is called Darmok, and it finds Captain Jean-Luc Picard on the left there, floating around space with the Enterprise D crew, and all of a sudden they're hailed by a group of aliens called the Tamarians, or as they call themselves, Childs of Tamar, or Children of Tamar. And now, Starfleet and the Federation have encountered the Tamarians before, but it's always been sort of strange because they haven't been able to communicate with them effectively. This is incredibly strange in the Star Trek universe because every ship comes equipped with a universal translator that is meant specifically to make communication between vastly different alien species possible and easy. But when the Tamarians start talking, they don't talk in normal sentence structures like one would expect a language to have. They talk in reference, they talk in metaphor. And that's actually where the episode's name comes from. One of these phrases, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, this sort of impenetrable metaphorical language that Captain Jean-Luc Picard is trying desperately to understand to develop communicative skills with this alien race. So as the episode continues, we start seeing these two working together and enacting what we come to find out Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra to literally mean. This phrase, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, we come to find out, is a reference to a mytho-historical story about these two people from very different walks of life, Darmok and Jalad, overcoming a great beast called Tanagra. And so what we learn here is that when the Tamarian says this over and over again, what he's trying to intimate to Captain Picard is that he would like to overcome this great difficult beast, namely understanding one another, by working together and overcoming it. And so what we find here is a really great example of what we're going to be calling intertext. And intertext is a very easy concept to understand. It's basically when stories are talking to one another. And what we see in this episode is that the Tamarians speak through allusion and metaphor. They reference these old stories to communicate with one another and eventually with people who don't even understand their language, like Captain Picard and the crew of the Enterprise. And what we see is that as the story progresses, Picard understands that this is how they talk, and he realizes that we actually talk to one another in references a lot too. A lot of our conversation is metaphorical and illusory. And so he starts discussing different stories with the Tamarian captain. He brings up the Odyssey. He brings up the Epic of Gilgamesh. He talks about these different stories, and they find this common ground through this referential intertextual language. But why am I bringing this up when I'm talking about Magic the Gathering? Well, the answer is pretty easy. I think that if you're wondering that, all you'd have to think about is any number of times that you engaged in a game of Magic the Gathering. Because if you don't think that you've done this kind of referential intertextual communication, I promise you have if you've sat down to duel someone. So I'm going to take three very specific examples up here and reckon that a lot of you know these cards, if not by sight, then by name or some other way. And I think what's interesting is that we may all have varying ideas of the Magic the Gathering lore background of these cards, but I think they also have a very specific meaning to people who know them. So for example, on the left, the Black Lotus card. This is a card that I, like many of you, have never seen and doubt I will ever see in my life. It's a very powerful card, but it's also a very symbolically powerful card. This is a card from the alpha set of Magic the Gathering. It's worth hundreds of thousands sometimes, depending on what condition it's in and what the market looks like. So this could mean a number of things to you. It could mean a really good game of Magic. It could mean a really good sort of look into the market of Magic if you have a card like this. Or it could be a sort of whimsical reminder of what Magic was like 20 plus years ago when people actually would play with these alpha set cards. Likewise, if you look at the card in the middle, so Aaron brought up this character, Nicol Bolas. And before Aaron and I started playing Magic together, I didn't know who this guy was in terms of the Magic the Gathering lore. I knew him as the card that Aaron would play, sometimes in conjunction with other cards, that would just ruin my night entirely. In particular, a game of Magic the Gathering in San Antonio, Texas that I will never forget, that was both fun and very frustrating because all of a sudden this mythical god being was set down on the cheap table that we had in front of us. And it didn't go well for me is my point. So I don't know him in terms of the lore necessarily. Likewise, if you look at the final card I have up here, I'm going to tell you a story about Emrakul, the Aeons Torn, which sounds like something that the Tamarian captain might say to get his point across, but actually it's a reference to when my friend Tomas lured me into playing Magic the Gathering under false pretenses that it would be a fun endeavor for everybody involved. It wasn't most of the time. For those of you unfamiliar with this card, I'll save you the time reading the text there. It basically says, if you're able to get this card on the field, you win. But it's not just winning. It's vindictive winning. It's spiteful winning. It's making your friend who sat down and spent quite a bit of money on cards, by the way, sitting them down and saying, you have made the wrong choice by being my friend. And when I think about this card, I think about all the fun, frustrating times that I had with my friend Tomas in high school, and what those stories mean to me. So I don't think about this thing in terms of what it means in the world of Magic the Gathering. I think about it in terms of the story that I created with my friend Tomas. And I think that if you think about what is in a duel, when you sit down to play a game of cards with somebody, what are you really doing? I think that, like Aaron mentioned, we're not really enacting this history that was set out before us by Wizards of the Coast. What you're doing is you're taking those cards, these placeholders for icons and characters and places and events, and you're sort of jumbling them up and taking the puzzle pieces out and putting them into a new configuration. And what's so special about that is that you're taking all of these references, you're using the intertext of Magic the Gathering and your game of it in the moment to tell an entirely new story, borrowing these elements from the story that was told to us by Wizards of the Coast to create your own tale. But that's all well and good. It's great to talk about, it's great to think about, but we're talking about video games, we're at PAX, we gotta bring them up. So I'm going to talk about the little game that could, Neo 2. For those of you unfamiliar with Neo 2, it's the sequel to Neo, which is a Souls-like game, as they're referred to. Basically what that means is it's sort of like Dark Souls. It's very difficult. You die a lot. There's a lot of cool monsters and demons, and the setting is very dark. But unlike Dark Souls, this Neo is a game that takes place in a very specific time period of Japan, and you're following a very specific historical character as he traverses Japan and fights demons and develops relationships with other historical figures at the time. So what's cool, though, about Neo 2 is that it doesn't really come off like a sequel in the sense that you're picking up where the first game left off. It presents itself as a prequel to the first game. It takes place before everything that happens in the first game. But if you've played the first game, then as you're walking through this era of Japan, you start recognizing places, you start recognizing names, start recognizing demons and weapons and all these kinds of things that you had encountered in your first encounter with the world of Neo. So as it's putting all these pieces in front of you, it actually does something a bit more interesting than the first game. It takes those pieces and it starts telling this different story with an emphasis on cooperating with people and developing those strong relationships and nurturing the bonds of friendship in a way that the first game doesn't really talk about. And so as you're going through it, you find that there's really no connection to the first game other than a name only, until, of course, Neo 2 pulls the rug out from under you. And when you think the story has finished and your character literally goes into a deep sleep, he or she is awoken by the character from the first game. And all of a sudden, Neo 2 becomes the end of Neo 1 that you weren't expecting to happen. So what's so great about this is that it takes the elements of Neo 2, namely cooperation, friendship, these deep relationships that you form with people who you meet in your life, and it takes that and says, what if we applied that to the first game? And we finished a story that didn't quite come to a close when we stopped that first game a couple of years ago. So here we see a great example of a video game using reference and using intertext to synthesize an entirely new story, because it's not just the end of Neo 2, it's not just the end of Neo 1, it's this great combination of both of them, putting an end to the overall story, and with you as a key player in it. And so in that way, it uses these references to its history, its past, these characters that you've come to know, to create an entirely new story. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Max.
Thank you very, very much, Dan. Hello, PAX. I'm extremely gratified and privileged and proud and very, very pleased as well to be here with you all today. I gather that the beautiful faces of Aaron and Dan are going to be a fair familiarity to a great many of you by now, and mine considerably less so. So a quick introduction before we get into the meat of things. My name's Max. I'm coming to you from a grassy glade, as you can see, in sunny London. I'm a long-standing collaborator with A Terrible Fate. If you're familiar with me at all, it'll probably be through my work on the comprehensive theory of Earthbound, but that's not what I'm here to talk to you about today. I'm here because we've reached a very interesting juncture in this particular conversation about the interrelation between these two gaming media, JRPGs and TCGs. And I think after the territories that Aaron and Dan have guided us through, we're left with, as it were, two questions that fundamentally govern the means by which these two gaming media can interact with and learn from each other. And those two questions are, what is the game and why do we play? And I think things are finally poised at the minute with respect to us being able to assess the ways in which there are means in great games, regardless of the media that they originate from, whether they are TCGs, whether they are JRPGs, or whether they're something else entirely, for aspects of player persona to be really formalized and to be explored. And to, I suppose, within those two macro questions that I just broached, to answer a third and even more encompassing question, which is how do the narrative and formal gameplay elements of great games, be they trading card games or be they Japanese RPGs, help involve, incubate, and ultimately express a whole series of player personas? So that is the grand question that we're going to attempt to answer in this final phase of our presentation today. And we're going to do so hopefully with the assistance of a particular concept known as superfluity. Now, of course, Magic is going to feature particularly heavily in this particular round of discussion. I'm showing both my age and the strength of my sentiment by selecting the Thorn Elemental as Magic's representative in this particular triptych. I mean, it's not quite alpha set, but it's still pretty old. Our first JRPG will be the inestimable Persona 5. I think it's not a particularly controversial statement to suggest that this is a game with already an existing consensus as being a landmark title in the JRPG landscape and the history of the genre, and most certainly a very skilled hijacker of lives, time, health, and potentially livelihood through its potency as a work of video game engineering and also as a pure piece of art. And then the second JRPG we're going to be looking at, slightly less heralded title, certainly more traditional than I think any other JRPG that we're going to be looking at in the course of this discussion, but nevertheless one that I think has profound things to say and volunteer towards this topic. The Sacred Stones from the Fire Emblem series. Again, not particularly heralded. It was the second Fire Emblem title to be localized into English, but nevertheless, as I say, something that I think has very interesting things to say about this overall topic of player personas within gaming and superfluity. Now I know what you're thinking, because I've mentioned the word twice. I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking, hold on, Prince William, right? With the obvious English literature major, what the hell is superfluity? I'll tell you exactly what superfluity is. So you may think that we've totally originated the term in and of itself, which we haven't. We have, however, sought to add something of an additional prong of definition to this word. So superfluous, the root in the Latin, the etymology of the word superfluous means to overflow. And superfluity in the context of gaming as we're applying it is the thing which allows us to have more choices in gaming that we can reasonably expect to exhaust within a single playthrough, as it were. There will be more elements to explore at a given strategic juncture or potentially even a narrative juncture than we can expect to be able to experience in one go. Now that is an absolute fundamental pillar of Magic and of any trading card game. No single card, however powerful, is altogether fundamental. Even some of these cards that are extraordinarily rare, extraordinarily potent, that Dan and Aaron have inspected at various points in their own branches of this particular presentation, none of them are utterly fundamental and essential, except insofar as any given player should decide that they are so, because they express a certain part of that player's sentimental history of the game or a particular strategic preference. Otherwise, all trading cards in the game are to some degree contingent. And JRPGs manifest a great deal of different types of superfluity as well. There is superfluity in the choice of party members within the overall carousel of available player characters. There might be 5, 9, 13, however many total party members that are available for a player to play through, and the player may, over the course of the game, owing to their own particular preferences and sensibilities within the game, choose to just rotate between maybe 3 or 4. There are other avenues of superfluity in JRPGs too: revivable party members, retrievable HP and MP, recoverable HP and MP, unlimited saves, a more or less unlimited store of purchasable items. I did say purchasable. It's just a idiosyncrasy. Don't worry about it. That a player can choose from, all of which are designed to give a player a maximum number of outlets for their own expression of persona within the game, and to give them a greater number of options. So having established what I hope is a fairly robust definition of superfluity, and don't worry, if it's still not entirely clear, it will hopefully become clear as we seek to apply it to our case study games through the rest of this presentation. Let's try and answer our first question. So what is this game? I think it's another fairly uncontroversial statement to suggest that games are basically based on a linear procedure that's often competitive. So in the case of a trading card game, there will be two players, each with decks of their own, will be placed down on the table, and the basic process is for those players to pit those decks against one another in a battle of strategic wits with the aim of emerging the winner, in the same way that the basic linear procedure of a JRPG is for the player to navigate a series of preordained narrative events through their own skill and growing technique and gameplay to arrive at a preordained narrative conclusion, which is also based on the ability to fulfill certain requirements in gameplay. However, I think it could very well be argued, and I think it's very interesting, moreover, to argue that the quality of a game, whatever its medium, whether it's a TCG, whether it's a JRPG, or again, if it's something else entirely, its quality is as much determined by the degree to which a player can successfully deviate or transcend entirely the limits of that linear procedure as by the quality of that linear procedure itself. In other words, we might go as far to suggest that a game's being able to obscure what within it exactly is the real game and what that actually constitutes is a kind of a mark of quality, because it suggests that the game itself is so capacious and is possessed of so many dimensions that it's accommodating of narratives other than its basic canonical one. So moving on to our second question, it's obviously intimately tied to the first. Why do we play? And why do we keep playing? I think one of the hallmarks of many of the games that we've inspected so far is that they have an enormous replay value. In some cases, that is of monumental evidence in the case of Magic, in the sense that it is a franchise and a legacy that's decades old and encompasses millions of players worldwide within it. And that's because the best games, whether they're new or whether they're old, afford us a unique set of expressive possibilities to be realized to some extent, and always a creative extent, within the game itself. It allows the development and cultivation of discrete persona types that are more or less unique to each player, either in the specific persona types that can be generated through discrete specialization of elements within the games, or through the combination of different, more preset persona types that a player can use to actualize themselves within the game. And part of that is going to involve the linear procedure, just the basic elements and tenets of playing through the game as it was originally or most basically intended to be experienced. So in a JRPG, this is done through favoring party members, as we explored earlier, through the specialization of characters, through leveling, through the use of customization engines within game. In more narratologically sophisticated games, it can be done through the invitation for players to commit to different story pathways. In Magic, so too, this is accomplished by a variety of elements, through the fact of building a deck, through establishing strategic preferences within that deck, through, in something that's quite unique to Magic, through the pursuit of flavor, through the pursuit of a certain narrative specificity that is related to the way in which a player chooses to build their own strategies within the game. But there's more. There's more to the cultivation and expression of persona within these titles than just these things. And that's exactly what we're going to explore now. So in summary of this first part of the presentation, or of this last part of the presentation, I should say, our main question as we ride things out is going to be, who are you? Who are we within the scope of this game? How are these gaming media giving us the means to reflect ourselves and our identities as players as we play? So first we're going to look at how Magic does it. So on a very basic level, Magic, as is the case with more or less any TCG that's worth its salt, allows a subtle differentiation of personality through deck construction, through the need of specialization to line cards, through the selection of colors, through the combination discrete of creature spells, enchantments, artifacts, and so on and so forth that a player may choose to put together in order to create the strategic combinations that are most fulfilling to them. Through the pursuit of flavor, as we noted before, which is an element unique to Magic. That's how Magic enables the expression of persona on the first level, at the first degree. However, it does so in a considerably deeper matrix of ways as well. And these are fundamentally based around the separate cultures which have sprung up around the game itself. And the potency of these cultures, the fecundity of these cultures, and the variety of them have really caused us to conceive of exactly what the game of Magic is in a different way, or if not what it is, then what it can be. For some, it's going to be the development of a pure dueling pedigree. Their raison d'etre within the game is, how good can I get at this? How proficient can I become in building decks? How good can I become in pitting my wits competitively against other players? And that is the thrill of the game. That's the thrill of a persona realized within the game. However, for others, it can be it can root in a completely different procedure. It can root in the thrill of a pack opening and the feeling of a push towards a completed possession of a given booster series. Now that in and of itself transcends the basic linear procedure of Magic, and yet who would deny that people who are interfacing with Magic in that way are players every bit as much as duelists? And it's in this way that Magic really opens our vistas up onto the wonderful world of gaming personas, as a given player can at any given point in their relationship with Magic ask themselves, well, am I a duelist first and foremost? Am I a collector and a pack opener? Am I a hobby player? Am I a tournament player? Am I a lore specialist, a kind of magic historian, as per the archetype and persona that Aaron explored very fulsomely in his own presentation segment? And we see thus Magic making the most of that idea of superfluity that we explored earlier, in both a strategic and, as it were, in a narrative sense as well. Because not only is there an infinite matrix of potential strategic options open to a player at a given time, either when they're building their deck or when they're actually in the process of a competitive match, but there's a considerable variety of available player personas too that allow the player to generate their own story, their own history within the game. So in that respect, to be a planeswalker, to be a pack opener, to be a lore specialist, to be any of these other personas is still to be a player of Magic at the Gathering. And as a result of Magic being able to entertain this massive amount of superfluity with such ease, it is with tremendous pride and extreme prejudice that I feel able to award it with a terrible fate gold award for maximum superfluity. Now, let's see how Persona 5 does something similar. So Persona 5 on the cursory level, on the surface level, actually does something very interesting with respect to Magic. So any of you who are vaguely familiar with Magic will know that there is a basic dichotomy within the player experience of the game in and of itself, in the sense that there exists obviously the out-of-game reality version of the player, but there also exists within the game a planeswalker, which is the proxy version of the player themselves. It's a sort of aspect of the realistic persona made fantastic, which again enables a much deeper and more satisfying sense of immersion within the bounds of the game and of the lore. And Persona 5 actually dramatizes this through its gameplay. We are at once within the game a regular student who is party and privy to all of the occasionally sublime and occasionally crushingly banal straits of life that any high school student, more or less anywhere in the world, is heir to. And at the same time as we are also a supernatural phantom thief who, in a touch that allows this particular part of the presentation to become a veritable festival of punnery, who uses and leverages the power of personas to acquire astonishing combat capabilities and powers of adventure. Now, these are two worlds that are exceptionally different from one another, and yet they are intrinsically tied and depicted as intrinsically tied within the scope of the game. So that's how Persona 5 allows the expression of a certain more dualistic sense of persona on the base level. But then once you start to dig in to the meat of the game, you see that there's an absolute festival of means by which Persona 5 allows for a more refined channeling of persona through its various elements. In fact, there are actually outlets in Persona 5 for players to interpolate many of their real life identities into the game with an unheralded, or rather an unprecedented hitherto, sense of verisimilitude to real life. There are in-game social features, there are school exercises, there's manga reading exercises. New areas can be unlocked by sitting on a train and reading a magazine. At the same time, the combat system enables a rather on-the-nose channeling of persona, in a strategic sense through the use of the persona characters themselves, which are rather reminded us of the Pokemon trading card game in and of themselves, and are depicted within the game as sources of strength from one's heart. There really is a tremendous amount of secondary means by which persona enables the cultivation and expression of discrete player personas in the game through a very multifarious approach to customizing the gaming experience, both in terms of the strategic aspects and the narrative aspects as well. And in that way, Persona 5 opens yet more vistas for us to observe different aspects of the wonderful world of gamer personas. From the JRPG side, in this case, the player can be at any given point an essentialist, someone whose basic means of savoring a gaming experience is playing the game through once enjoying and savoring to the max the various narrative twists and turns that they are heir to as a result, and whereupon the moment of greatest enjoyment and or edification in the gaming experience comes at the point of the story being resolved. They can also be a completionist, those who are not satisfied until every eventuality is exhausted, every item collected, every potential narrative fork explored. The gamer in the source of or rather in the effort of trying to acquire or establish their persona will then ask themselves, or may ask themselves, am I a speedrunner? Am I a fanfic creator? Do I play under other self-imposed disciplines? And in this way, much like Magic the Gathering does, Persona 5 uses superfluity to the absolute maximum. There's the maximum variety of playing approaches. There's a huge width of combat styles. And all of these elements combine to create an appropriately finely layered representation of an individual player's own persona. And much in the same way that Persona 5 allows a player to be a ruthlessly efficient phantom thief, or more of a procrastinator or a romancer, while making all of these things thoroughly legitimate avenues towards enjoyment and fulfillment within the game, we can also, with great security, award Persona 5 the With a Terrible Fate Gold Award for maximum superfluity. So we're 2 for 2 so far. Now, onto the wild card, Fire Emblem: The Sacred Stones. Now, as I alluded to earlier, Fire Emblem: The Sacred Stones is by far the most traditional of the RPGs that we've looked at so far. And on a surface level, many of the means by which it gives players means to establish their own personas within the game are very traditional and will be very well known to anyone who has had even a cursory history of interaction with the JRPG genre. Persona is established primarily through the choice of preferred unit classes and deployment that the player uses within the game, through the way in which these are junctioned to item specialization, through the way these are combined with map tile strategy, the way you position different units in relation to one another on the map. And there's a certain amount of diplomacy with enemy units that are allowed as well to give that that fundamental first layer of gameplay a little bit of extra flavor. But this is all quite fundamental, basic stuff with respect to JRPGs. It's certainly not anything that in and of itself will turn that many heads. But there is one profound complicating element that reframes the entire narrative and structural gameplay feeling which the Sacred Stones imparts to its players, and fundamentally informs too the way in which it allows personas to develop within the playing experience. And that one profound complicating element is permadeath. So as its name suggests, permadeath is the idea that once an in-game character dies, they cannot be revived under any circumstances other than restarting the game. And this permadeath, the existence of permadeath within this gaming matrix, obliges a considerably greater sense of self-determination in terms of strategy on behalf of the player. Players have to look further down the line into uncharted maps that have yet to come, that they have yet to experience within the game, to make the consideration: can I afford to lose this unit that is of my present attention? Now, not only does permadeath have a considerable strategic component in shaping persona and the gamer's persona within the game, but there's a deathly component thereby that comes to the narrative and emotive components of the Sacred Stones. One of the things that was most lauded for when it came out was its depth of characterization and the way in which it does establish very strong and potent emotional ties between the player and the played, as it were. And permadeath really brings us to an entirely new degree of emotive poignancy. Through that rich characterization, and also strategically through unit scarcity. We come to feel, as we're playing the game, rather like a unit commander in charge of their soldiers, albeit not one who observes their troops in an impersonal way as one would in, for instance, even in a trading card game, or in, to use a slightly closer cousin of this particular game and gaming style, something like Advance Wars, whereby if we were to lose a particular unit type, there is but a factory and the end of a turn between us and generating another unit of the exact same kind. No, not in the Sacred Stones. In the Sacred Stones, there is personal significance that is endowed to our actions, and we are thus invested in and recreated within the game in a way that, in some respects, can even be made to feel rather enervating or not entirely enjoyable at all points. The strength of Magic the Gathering strategically is its superfluity, as we've observed. The strength of the Sacred Stones is rather the inverse of superfluity, which is scarcity. And in the same way, the strength of Persona 5 is the variety of personas that it services, which is more or less indefinite. Whereas the strength of the Sacred Stones is the way in which it, rather than providing a player with an more or less infinite, or at least an extremely numerous palette of potential personas, it contracts all players and all playing experiences into a single persona, which they may occupy sometimes, as I alluded to, somewhat unwillingly or with a certain amount of trepidation. As a result, there is but a single persona by which we can experience the Sacred Stones. You are the unit's commander, and they will die if you make the wrong decision. And that amounts to a single persona for all players, and one with a very deep degree of felt and emotive realism about it. And therefore, while the Sacred Stones doesn't necessarily lavish us with superfluity, it does make a particularly ingenious use of it. And for that reason, we see fit to award it the With a Terrible Fate Rose Award for ingenious use of superfluity. And with that, I will kick it back over to our head honcho to ride us home.
So remember, guys, we started this with an opportunity to compare two different interactive forms of storytelling media that we typically think of purely on their own terms, right? Asking, what if we thought about JRPGs in conversation with Magic the Gathering? What can we learn about them? But I think the thing that I want to leave you with is that hopefully, you've been encouraged to think about each of them in conversation with one another broadly, but also notice we've discovered that within each of these modes of storytelling, there are actually numerous different sub-modes of storytelling. You can play a game story from beginning to end, as with the Ocarina of Time, or you can tell a totally different story like the kinds that speedrunners do, right? When they tell the story of how to reach the conclusion as quickly as possible and explore unique facets of the world, such as glitches, which you see here, that you would never discover if you were just playing the narrative from beginning to end, but which indeed is a different kind of game, and with it a different kind of story with which you're engaging and which you're creating. Just so with Magic, you might initially have thought, as I did, that the game is really just and the story that the players tell is that thing that happens when we sit down and play with our friends or play competitively or something like that. But there are many other kinds of games and stories that can be played and told with Magic. Something as simple as the act of opening a pack and uncovering different aspects of Magic's lore and trying to piece it together from those random vignettes and windows into the story that you get can in fact be a story unto itself. And I think Wizards is reinforcing that idea very well with this new kind of booster, the set booster that they're creating, which just has as its focus telling as interesting and compelling a story of pack opening as it can, right? And so I hope that this is just the beginning and not the end of you being encouraged to think comparatively about these different kinds of interactive storytelling, because as someone who was engaged with both of these for many, many years, engaging with this exercise for me totally gave me a new way to think about them. And as we've been saying throughout, and as Max so wonderfully wrapped up with the idea of personas, because they are interactive, the more you're able to unpack them, so too are you able to unpack your role as a player and who you are and how you express yourself as a person through these. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. We really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for being a part of PAX Online. If you want to keep the conversation going, please, 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 we would love to do that. You can find all of our other work at withaterriblefate.com. You can find us hanging out right after this in the PAX official discussion channel of their Discord for PAX Online. Hope to see you there. Hope to see you around. If you have questions about our work, feel free to hit us up anytime. Our contact info is on the site. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great rest of PAX Online.